Welcome, everyone, to this rapid response webinar sponsored by SIPA and the Institute of Global Politics. We are at a critical moment as we see India and Pakistan, after a period of uneasy peace, once again on the brink of a larger conflict. It was promising to see the announcement of a ceasefire over the weekend, but the situation remains both tenuous and tense. Tensions were kicked off with the brutal April 22nd terrorist attack in India-controlled Kashmir, killing 26 civilians on holiday. A volley of attacks and retaliation followed, including missile strikes in Pakistan-administered Kashmir and drone strikes in northern India. India and Pakistan have waged 3 wars over the disputed territory of Kashmir. But changing dynamics, modern weaponry, and disinformation attempts by both sides give this emerging conflict even more troubling dimensions. Drone warfare, relatively new to the region, is helping to shape this conflict now. And of course, both countries have nuclear capabilities. But let's be clear, the responsibility for the current escalation rests with the terrorist entities responsible for the attack, perpetrators that had the space to organize, plan, and carry out their brutality. International dynamics also impact the region's stability. Afghanistan remains a contributing factor to unrest and volatility in the region. Meanwhile, China has stepped up its arms sales to Pakistan, but it is unlikely to intervene or risk a war with India. The current administration in Washington has yet to appoint an ambassador to either India or Pakistan, but did engage in some long-distance diplomacy over the last few days. I've spent a lot of time in this critical region, as have a number of our panelists, and I remember well when President Clinton visited in 2000 to set in motion a new, modern, separate, and dynamic relationship with both India and Pakistan. Some of you watching today may have studied crisis decision-making in the class that Dean Karen Yarhi-Milo and I teach at SIPA called Inside the Situation Room. So you're going to be seeing some of the concepts that we have talked about play out on the world stage in the coming days, weeks, and months. Crises like this one present decision makers with compressed timelines, incomplete and sometimes very inaccurate information, a very high signal-to-noise ratio, all of which makes action and outcomes hard to predict. I believe that in today's discussion, we will reiterate that the true end of this ongoing conflict can only come from dialogue and decisions made in Pakistan and India. Outside actors cannot force a resolution, but we all are interested in doing everything we can to help facilitate a lasting peace. You'll hear more in our discussion today about the factors at play as to how leaders are assessing their decisions, their choices, and making them on the ground. We have a wonderful group of panelists, and it's my pleasure to introduce them. Shamila Chaudhary is a foreign policy expert, former National Security Council Director for Pakistan and Afghanistan. Jon Finer is a former assistant to President Biden and principal deputy national security advisor and an IGP Carnegie Distinguished Fellow. Rajan Menon is the chair in political science at the City College of New York and adjunct senior research scholar at Columbia. Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is also an IGP Carnegie Distinguished Fellow. Rumela Sen is a faculty member at the Arnold A. Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies and South Asia Institute at Columbia. And to lead today's conversation, we have Stephen Biddle, Professor of International and Public Affairs at Columbia. Thank you all for joining this important conversation. Over to you, Stephen.
Thanks, Secretary Clinton, and thanks for those introductions. So let's dive right in. Let me start with Rumela Sen. So, Rumela, how did we get here? What are the immediate causes of the crisis? What produced the ceasefire? And do you think the ceasefire is going to hold?
Right. Thank you, Steve, and thank you for everybody for organizing this very important webinar at this very important time. Well, as Secretary Clinton highlighted, I guess the most immediate cause, as we all know, was this terrorist attack on April 22nd, 2025 by the Resistance Front, which is, an offshoot of the Pakistan-based militant organization Lashkar-e-Toiba. So, 26 civilians who were just tourists, ordinary people, were killed. And so, even though that particular terrorist, incident is the immediate cause, we also sort of have to see this as a continuation of a series of terrorist attacks that Pakistan has conducted on Indian territory. And again, as Secretary Clinton mentioned before, India and Pakistan has also fought a few wars: 1947, 1965, 1971, 1999, the Mumbai terrorist attack, the Parliament attack in 2001. So all of these are very related. And, in terms of the ceasefire, will it last? My instinctive answer is who knows? But I think the factor that is, I think we should consider when we consider this terrorist attack and also what will happen next is the kind of regimes we have in Pakistan, the military elite in Pakistan that dominates the decision making in this country, and also the kind of democracy that we have in India, in the sense that one of the factors that determines whether a ceasefire will hold or how we can check escalation is the democratic space. And, a lot of commentators have commented on this, that given the role of the press in India and how restricted and belligerent sometimes the media has been in calling for more war and the high emotions that are running around this terrorist event and killing of innocent citizens, those are all factors that might contribute to, in what direction the escalation will go and how much the ceasefire will hold.
So what do you think was the key factor in bringing the ceasefire about? I mean, lots of people were concerned that this might escalate to nuclear weapons use. It happily is not. What was behind that, do you think?
I mean, from what we all know is that the United States played a very important role. The first declaration of the ceasefire was from the social media post of the President of the United States. One of the things that is now very much in discussion is that whether that ceasefire is really in the interest of India, in the sense that it made it look like an outside international power is now dictating to India. The resolution of a Kashmir situation, which has always been against India's stated policy, in that India wants anything to do with Kashmir and in the region to be resolved bilaterally. So, in a democracy, as those of us who have studied foreign policy making, we know that it's a two-level game, and the politicians who are in charge of making a decision are also signaling to the domestic audience. So from India's perspective, it was not a very good signal to the domestic audience in India that United States actually played an instrumental role in facilitating this ceasefire.
Yeah, thanks. Let's go to Rajan Menon. Rajan, can you walk us a little further back? What are the roots of the Kashmir problem underneath the crisis, and what role does Kashmir play in Indian and Pakistani security policies and strategies more broadly?
Thanks very much, Steve. From where I sit, I can see a halo-like light on the side of my face. I apologize. It should be on the top of my head, actually, but we can't have everything we want. I'm going to march through history with 7 league boots, meaning taking great liberty. So in 1947, as you all know, the British Raj, i.e. the South Asian Empire of Britain, was divided. And 2 states came into being, India and Pakistan. Until 1971, Pakistan had an eastern wing, which is now Bangladesh. It became Bangladesh because of the 1971 war between India and Pakistan. Pakistan saw itself as the home for South Asia's Muslims. It is a Muslim majority state, although multi-ethnic. To this day, it has about 96% of its population as Muslim. India is multi-ethnic and a kaleidoscope of languages and cultures, but it does have a large Muslim population. It's today about 200 million, almost the size of Pakistan's population, although not quite. Pakistan believes that as a Muslim majority region, Kashmir belongs to Pakistan and not to India. And it has never accepted the circumstances under which Kashmir acceded to India. Now, what are those circumstances? In the division of 1947, Kashmir was an oddity. It had a Muslim majority population, but the ruler, Maharaja Hari Singh, was a Hindu. He wanted originally to be independent. When tribesmen came across the border from Pakistan to force the issue, he appealed for Indian help, and India said, we'll be happy to help you, but you have to sign an instrument of accession. And so this, in Pakistan's eyes, was an undemocratic way for Kashmiris to be forced to make the choice. That led to the first war between India and Pakistan, 1947-48. If you hear the term line of control today, that is the line that demarcates the ceasefire along 1947-48. By my count, India and Pakistan have either had wars, skirmishes, confrontations, 5 in number. 3 of them have been nuclear. It's not just a state-to-state conflict, because as the previous speaker mentioned, there are terrorist groups, Lashkar-e-Toiba, Hizbul Mujahideen, Jaish-e-Mohammed, that have conducted terrorist attacks in Kashmir and in other parts of India as well, which India insists are linked to Pakistan. Pakistan says no, but on occasion, these have been the precipitants of conflict, as was the case this time when in the Kashmiri area of Pahalgam, 26 Hindu pilgrims, shall we say, were killed. So that's the short version.
Okay, remarkably concise in covering such a broad span. So, given that Kashmir has been a flashpoint and is likely to continue to be a flashpoint, I mean, what role does it play in the way both of these states think about their national security and think about their strategy and the whole problem of regional security and stability?
Until 2014, when Prime Minister Narendra Modi of the Bharatiya Janata Party, whose underlying movement, the RSS, is a kind of a right-wing Hindu party, India saw itself as secular. It had many religions, many languages, but the concept was one of civic Indian identity. I would say that under Modi, that has begun to erode very sharply. And the concept of Hindutva, which there's no real good English translation for it, but let's call it the land of Hindus, makes Muslims feel like second-class citizens. As for Kashmir, it had a special status in the Indian Constitution under Article 370. And recently, Modi revoked that article, which meant that autonomy was canceled. So Kashmir is important to Pakistan because Pakistan's identity is that of a South Asian Muslim state. It's important to India because India feels that as a great power, its territorial integrity is important. And no matter what the circumstances under which Kashmir came under its control, it is determined to keep it. The worst part of this conflict, since 1974, when the two countries became operationally nuclear, is nuclear weapons. On the other hand, the best part of this conflict is nuclear weapons, if all goes well, because they do have a way of concentrating the mind. And so you asked earlier, how did this crisis wind down so fast? It's the shortest confrontation, 4 days, relative to the others. There was a lot of diplomacy. By the way, besides the US, the Indians and Pakistanis denied that the US had a critical role, but that's beside the point. Something like 24 at least countries, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the UAE and others were involved. There's no question that both sides were aware of the danger of escalation, even if they didn't want to. Once the spiral began, it could take them to a dangerous place that neither of them wanted to go.
Thanks for that. Let's go with Jon Finer. So, do you see any parallels between the current crisis and past flashpoints? What lessons can we draw from U.S. diplomatic or crisis management efforts in prior India-Pakistan escalations for policy going forward here?
So honestly, Stephen, I see more contextual differences than I do contextual similarities, and I think it's worth maybe just highlighting a few of them. One is compared to the last major flare-up and all of the others that preceded this one, India has shifted its main security focus and security concern to the north, to China. Not that they no longer pay as close attention to Pakistan as a potential security threat. They obviously do. But in the Indian strategic hierarchy of concerns, China looms much larger and much higher than Pakistan does, which in some ways I think is a moderating force on an Indian response. I think the last thing they want is to be bogged down in a conflict with Pakistan while they're figuring things out with China. A second is there is just much deeper bipartisan U.S. support for India than there has been previously. And that's been a sort of upward trajectory, as I think everyone on this panel knows, over a number of years. But I think that is a sort of a reassuring factor that probably also played a moderating role in India's response and may explain to some extent why they tolerated more intervention, if it's in fact true that the administration did as it claimed to have done, than they have in the past. As has been said already, they often are extremely reluctant to have outside engagement, and particularly American engagement. A third strategic context factor that's changed a bit is Afghanistan. With the United States out of Afghanistan, it is less dependent on Pakistan for the ability to transfer resources and supplies than it was previously. The United States is also less vulnerable to a potential flare-up, including by some of the militia groups in Pakistan that are aligned with one side or another. Which is and has been able to do this without, I think, shedding influence, as I think we found in our administration did not diminish our influence in South Asia, and this administration seems to be finding the same thing, which I think is a good thing. The one factor I think that cuts in the other direction, maybe, but it didn't ultimately end up overwhelming the others, is that this is a moment where the international system is incredibly fractious. So kind of collective action by partners in a situation like this. You mentioned 24 countries. I strongly suspect that this was 24 countries going in with the same basic message, but in a pretty uncoordinated way compared to how this has been handled in the past, just given the fractured nature of the moment. Last thing I'll say is I think there's a lot we still don't know. Something clearly spooked the United States to get much more deeply engaged and involved toward the very end of this crisis. Something they learned, I think, that gave them more concern about escalation. We don't know what that was. And then the last thing we really don't know is the role of China, obviously a close partner of Pakistan, but also a country that is on its own charm offensive to try to cool India's tension towards China right now. So did not want this escalation, I think, with Pakistan that they're backing as they try to improve their relationship with India. Anyway, my thoughts.
Great. Let's go to Mike Pompeo, who, by the way, has to leave early today for another commitment. So if he logs off, it's not necessarily a protest on the content of the remainder of the program. So Secretary Pompeo, you were Secretary of State during a similar flare-up. Can you reflect on how that crisis was managed behind the scenes, how lessons from that episode might or might not apply to the management of the problem today?
You bet. Look, it was different. This particular flare-up was different in the sense that it didn't stem from a terror attack in the same way that this did. It was a different spark that lit the fuse. It was also the case that we engaged as quickly as we could because both sides were making claims about what the other was doing with respect to its own nuclear arsenal. Obviously, I don't know if that was also true in this instance. John was speaking earlier about what spooked the United States. Maybe that was it. It was certainly in our time where each side was asserting that the other was preparing for a very rapid, very escalatory sequence over a very short time period. So we knew it was essential that we take down the tension as quickly as we could. I was actually traveling. I was in Vietnam, if I remember correctly, and so we were actually in the right time zone to do this. Our ambassadors did great work. One of the things that the United States doesn't have the advantage of here is I don't think either of our ambassadors on station there yet. Ours both were at the time. Ken Juster was in India doing remarkable work for us in that moment. But I think we had two things going for us and one thing going against us. One was we'd engaged quickly, and we made it very clear to both sides that we knew the answer and they were both wrong. Neither side was actually engaged in that conduct, and we could demonstrate to them that neither side had begun to move up its nuclear posture to a more advanced readiness level. So those two were in our favor. Against us was, frankly, I think having been the CIA director and had very difficult set of relationship with the ISI and the Pakistani intelligence services, and who had been an advocate for building out the United States relationship with India, I don't think the trust levels between the two during the conversations were the same. I think the Indians thought that I was much more inclined, and that the United States was much more inclined to help them and side with them in this particular incident as well. But in the end, over the course of a long series of hours, we were able to get both sides to back down and come to an accommodation for what has proven to be a temporary ceasefire, and I suspect this one too will prove to be ephemeral.
Let's go to Shamila Chaudhary. And let's talk a little bit about civil-military relations. So civil-military relations are always crucial in international crises, and the civil-military relationship in Pakistan has historically been fraught. So from your time in the White House, how has Pakistan's civil-military relationship evolved? And should we be concerned with its implications for Kashmir or for regional stability more broadly in the future?
Steve, thanks for that question. Let me actually just make a comment on a question you've already asked, which is what if the U.S. got spooked? I actually think that what's unique about this time around compared to, say, 2019 with Balakot is that the amount of targets hit inside Pakistan were more than in the past. So there's a simple kind of numbers game here that we're observing from the outside. In the settled areas, so outside of Kashmir, let's say. And in Balakot, it was outside of Kashmir, obviously, right? It was in KPK. But when you have attacks in places like Punjab and on air bases, the U.S. and others should rightly take note. And so I think just being on the outside, I think it was as simple as that, and that this tit for tat that we've grown accustomed to has reached a new level, a new threshold of escalation, which should be worrisome. The civil question is a good one because we tend to, again, from an outside of Pakistan, outside of India perspective that I have, we tend to look at the civil relations in Pakistan as a purely domestic issue. But I would propose that we look at it as kind of a four-body problem of sorts. So first is the problem of scope, which is civil relations inside Pakistan affect domestic politics. It affects the strength of civilians, and it affects the strength of diplomacy, but it also shapes how crisis management happens with countries like India, and I would argue with Afghanistan and others when tensions rise, because the issues that the military is involved in, they have domain over, are issues like Kashmir. And so the civilians really have a very limited scope and bandwidth to take the lead on those things. And those issues are the ones that fracture regional stability and draw the attention of the international community. So one, it's a problem of scope. Two, it's a problem of who's in charge. And this is something that I saw during my time at the White House. There's always this little game that the United States has to play. We care about the security issues, but we also want to empower the civilian government. But we know that the military elite are the ones that are working on the issues and possess the agency on the issues we care the most about. So there's a little bit of theater that gets, that goes into action when there are crises to be managed. And there's always a question from the outsider of, who do I talk to and when do I talk to them? And do I talk to them in front of people or behind the scenes? And then you have to coordinate. And so in the case of when I was at the White House, we had a situation where President Zardari, who was in power then, was very forward-leaning on the relationship with India, said so in his first several weeks and months in office. It culminated in a 2012 visit to India, where it was largely focused on cultural and trade ties. The U.S. always looks at these openings as very promising, like, okay, that's good. They're doing something at least. And perhaps we could add on security issues later. But we didn't. We took what we could get at that time because, back to John's point, Afghanistan was looming large in our calculus, and we actually needed to work with the Pakistani military on Afghanistan. That was more important. And so we made a decision essentially implicitly to not empower civil relations in that case. Now, that's a situation where there's not a crisis happening. That's just in normal kind of peacetime. I'm saying peacetime ironically. There's also a problem of interlocutors, and this is a uniquely India-Pakistan problem. Just like the US is looking for appropriate partners to work with in Pakistan, the Indians are a civilian, led kind of government, and the military falls firmly underneath that. And so there's always this problem of getting the two countries to talk on these security issues because Indians want to talk to their counterparts. And in Pakistan, sometimes there's no counterpart to talk to. For example, right now, there's no national security advisor in Pakistan. The position doesn't exist. So who do they talk to? And that's really important for the Indians. For the Pakistanis, there's more flexibility, less so. This is precisely why third-party interlocutors have to get involved because of this disconnect between the two sides in levels. And then finally, I'll end with this problem of options, if you will. If the military in any country is leading the charge, the solutions are always going to be military focused, right? They're not going to be politically focused. And so there's this alignment that's missing, a fragmentation of authority that makes it unclear, like in Pakistan, who's speaking for what during these most critical moments. And it limits the diplomatic off-ramps that we have available to de-escalate conflict. So let me stop there.
Yeah, so certainly for grand strategy and diplomacy generally, integrating the military and the political is key. It's always key. That said, let's dive a little deeper on some of the military issues in particular. So let me go back to Rumela Sen. The nuclear shadow in this crisis is, I suspect, why a lot of our participants are logged on, and it's certainly a front of mind concern for lots of people around the world and in the region. Can you tell us a little more about how India and Pakistan's divergent nuclear doctrines might affect the ladder of escalation and the problem of escalation management? Is there any evidence that, from what we've seen in behavior in this crisis so far, that either side is posturing for nuclear signaling in their behavior here?
Yes, thanks, Steve. I will draw a little bit on the previous question that you asked to answer this question, which is the civil-military relations in Pakistan and how different it is from how things work out in India. It is, by my count, there has only been 2 democratic transfer of power in Pakistan. And the most recent one, the first one was in 2013. Right, it was from to the Nawaz Sharif government, and the second one was from the Sharif government to Imran Khan in 2018. So that, and in addition, if you look at the number of coups and conspiracies in Pakistan that has controlled the politics of Pakistan, it started all the way in 1951 with the Rawalpindi conspiracy against the first Prime Minister of Pakistan, that was Liaquat Ali Khan. All of this to say that, as Shamila was highlighting before, is that there's always been a lot of uncertainty and instability in how politics and decision-making works within Pakistan. And that has a very serious impact on its relationship with India as well. Now, from India's perspective, I think the stability that we are all looking to is the democracy, and that we know that if something, the closest thing we have to law in international relations is that democracies don't fight. And the mechanisms are that, it takes a lot of time to convince all the stakeholders to actually go to war. But we also know that democracies are very likely to fight with non-democracy. So, all of this to say that even to understand the nuclear situation, which has sort of been the reason why everybody is terrified of a war in South Asia, it all operates in the context of democracy. And as Rajan highlighted a little bit before, because the democratic space in India is reducing, and because, even in the current crisis, you would expect that the opposition would play the role of the opposition and, ask the right questions. Instead, all we heard was the political opposition in India just exaggerating and further reinforcing the call for wars that was coming from either the social media or the print media. Right, so this creates a very, unstable and dangerous situation for nuclear escalation. And now, in this context, to also highlight the difference between India and Pakistan in terms of their nuclear doctrine, and this difference in nuclear doctrine between India and Pakistan further exaggerates the strategic instability, and particularly at the lower levels of escalation. So India's doctrine sort of aims to raise the nuclear threshold because India has this no first use, which basically means that India pledges not to use nuclear weapons unless attacked first by nuclear weapons, but it also promises a very devastating response in case of any nuclear attack. Right, so this massive retaliation, which forms the basis of this idea of credible minimum deterrence, that India maintains nuclear capability only to deter adversaries and not really to fight war. Pakistan, on the other hand, in addition to this reliance on the military elite, and the very tense civil-military relations, actually does not adopt the no first use policy, and it reserves the right to use nuclear weapons. And the reason for this is very clear, because Pakistan, whether in its nuclear doctrine or in its use of these militant groups to infiltrate India from time to time, it is trying to balance what it considers is a conventional and diplomatic superiority of India and the upper hand that India has. And so that difference, so Pakistan's doctrine basically lowers the nuclear threshold, right? And so again, what we have to also take into account in understanding and contextualizing this nuclear doctrine is what incentives do these countries, and particularly the elites in Pakistan, have to use the nuclear weapons, which so far from the perspective of rational decision-making seems like, in spite of all the ambitions and the domination of the military elite, there is no incentive for them to use a nuclear weapon, even though their doctrine allows for the first use. So, I mean, that's the hope and sanity that we all have, but that's also been the reason that everybody gets really nervous whenever there is a flare-up in the region. And one last thing I want to say is the risk of this is, when we hear that this has been going on for thousands of years, as in this has been going on forever, I think it also risks this sort of complacency with this, that this happens, these people fight, and then they make up again. But in the process, it's the ordinary people. We tend to forget that 26 tourists who were just there with their families were killed. And every single time, it is ordinary people in both the countries, and particularly the civilians in Kashmir, that have suffered for the longest time in the most militarized zone of the world. So we cannot lose sight of that, even though we know that the nuclear weapons will probably never be, and hopefully never be, a real option.
Well, just by way of a brief follow-up, underneath the general issue of doctrine is the physical issue of proximity and vulnerability. So relative to the US and the Soviet Union in the Cold War, for example, these are two nuclear powers that are cheek to jowl and that have relatively new arsenals. There was some commentary earlier in the crisis that the targeting that the two sides were using in their conventional attacks during the crisis might have been getting nervously or uncomfortably close to potentially nuclear targets, either the command and control system or other aspects of the two sides' nuclear capabilities. Do you think there's any reason for concern? Were these reports alarmist? And if so, is there any chance that had anything to do with decisions by outsiders, the United States or otherwise, to intervene and try and put a stop to this?
As everyone has highlighted, there's lack of information. We would never know. This is probably going to be classified information that intelligence in all the different countries would only know. So, I mean, who knows? But I would still say there was, this time around, there were fears that this might happen. And the way the war was escalating, particularly also from India's side, right? And again, I want to go back to this idea of signaling to the domestic audience, because the government in India was trying to do that. Because wars are, there are no best wars, but the wars should be fought from a strategic standpoint and not from emotions. So it seemed like for the Indian government, particularly given that it's a democracy, the emotions were running so high in the television, for example, in social media, for example, there was this tendency for India to move away from what has historically been more signaling towards multilateralism and more maintaining more of a low-key position to more jingoism and warmongering, even at the highest level, sometimes from the officials and the ministers and the spokesperson, and which sort of this, that is where I think some of the concerns come from, all of these incentives for democratically elected leaders to be sort of wolves in social media and posture as we can attack and destroy and win. That created some of the concern that this might escalate beyond control, because it created a sort of incentive for democratic leaders to actually escalate it more and posture as more of a stronger force, as a stronger party, which was historically not the case for India. In terms of third-party involvement, I'm sure, if you look at the history, because we don't have the facts of what is happening now, we have to look at history and what we know. We know that, there is reasonable hope that they will go to the brink of mutual destruction and then come back. So that hope, I think, was there this time as well. But I think the involvement of third parties, and particularly United States, can definitely be seen as a victory for Pakistan than for India.
Okay.
It is not in the interest of India to have United States involved in this.
So moving to the non-nuclear but still military side of the conflict, Rajan Menon, can you walk us through the non-nuclear side of what's been going on? Did the military instruments on the two sides carry out their missions successfully? Did we see anything new or different in the conduct of operations relative to what we would have expected from recent experience in Ukraine, Nagorno-Karabakh, or elsewhere? Secretary Clinton highlighted the drone use in this crisis. Is there anything new here or unusual?
Steve, with your permission, before I do that, just a couple of clarifications.
Sure.
The 2019 Balakot War, the precipitant was in fact a terrorist attack. There was an attack on a convoy of the Indian Central Reserve Police Force that was traveling between Jammu and Srinagar in India-held Kashmir, and 40 police officers were killed. So there is a comparison between that one and this one. That crisis was in some sense dicier because an Indian MiG-21 was shot out of the sky and an Indian wing commander was taken into Pakistani custody, and it was resolved. So that could have gone sideways in a way that made it even more dangerous than this. Quickly on the nuclear question, yes, it is true that Pakistan has a no first use policy. It's not hard to figure out why. It is outclassed vastly by India in every metric of power, GNP, population, army size, weaponry, and so on. However, the Pakistanis have been very clear to draw narrow lines about the conditions under which they will use nuclear weapons. First, if India cuts off downstream flows to Pakistan from the Indus River system, because it irrigates about 80% of Pakistan's arable land. Second, if a substantial proportion of the Pakistani army is destroyed. Thirdly, if large chunks of Pakistani territory are seized for a long time. Now, India will not do the first, because it would be an act of outright war. It doesn't have the capacity to do the second, in my opinion. So I don't want to minimize the nuclear risk, but I think the two sides are well aware of this. By the way, Indian nuclear doctrine is also in some degree of flux. I mean, I don't know enough about this to be sure, but there are reports that it is also inching toward first use. Now, on the conventional side, and forgive me for getting to your question late, the war has been fought from the air, through drones, and through air-to-air and air-to-surface missiles. India, for the first time since 1971, struck 2 military bases outside of Kashmir in the Indian province of Punjab. I'm sorry, the Pakistani province of Punjab. India also, by the way, has a province called Punjab. It hit a base very close to Army headquarters in Rawalpindi, and it hit another base, Murid, which is the storehouse, or one of the storehouses for Pakistani drones. So this was a much deeper strike. The Pakistanis retaliated as well, using both drones and missiles. On the ground, there was small arms fire across the LOC, the line of control, but also mortar and artillery fire. There was no war at sea, but at one point, the two navies began to converge on the Arabian Sea, and this did not last through the duration of the crisis, but the Indians sent the Vikrant, which is one of their aircraft carriers, a carrier battle group, as well as submarines, more as a show of force than anything else. So this was a multi-sided war. It is, and you will correct me if I'm mistaken about this, it's the first war between nuclear armed states, I think, that we've seen in which drones have played such a significant role. It is not at all surprising, given that everybody has watched what has happened in Ukraine, which would be in a much worse shape did it not have a cottage industry of all variety of drones that have been used for deep strike in the Russian Federation. So that's kind of the size of the conventional thing. I will say one final thing. I'm aware about the role that outside powers play, but it's very important to understand that this is not the first rodeo for the Indian and Pakistani armies. These are very professional armies that know each other very well. They don't like each other, but they're not stupid. They're acutely conscious of the degree of risk involved. So without dismissing the role of outside powers, I think it's important to notice that the two antagonists have a great deal of agency, and that all of that together, nuclear escalation, the fear of a conventional war getting out of hand, plus outside mediation, if you will, not quite mediation, something short of that, help wind down the war on the ground and in the air.
Thanks. With the time we have remaining, let me go to a round robin, as it were, and pose the same question to everyone on the panel. And that's, what do you see as the prognosis here? Where is this conflict going in your crystal balls? And what should any of the actors, India, Pakistan, or outside powers, be doing to reduce the risk of escalation, rekindling of the crisis, or further violence? And let me start with Mike Pompeo, because I know he has to leave shortly. Secretary Pompeo. Or he may have had to leave more shortly than we realized. So in this event, let me go with Shamila Chaudhary.
Thank you. This is a hard question. We get asked it all the time. Where are things headed every time the flare-up happens? I will say that just going off of Rajan's comments, that this particular instance of tit for tat showed a willingness or ability to go far deeper than in the past. And to me, that is a reflection that the strategic environment has fundamentally changed. It's not this traditional period of stable deterrence that we've become accustomed to. There's a lot of episodic volatility and long stretches of diplomatic silence in between these flare-ups between the two countries. So I think that over time is going to continue to erode institutional guardrails that we used to look to help manage the risk. On that, the formal diplomatic environment has weakened. We've mentioned several times there are no ambassadors. Back channels exist, but they're fragile. And this mutual signaling that occurs, whether from the Indians or the Pakistanis or foreigner external actors, through be it social media or press releases, it just has lost credibility. And so these subtle cues that used to matter just don't matter anymore. On top of that, the information environment has made it worse. And in both countries, we've mentioned the nationalist media dominating, but then there's this raw emotion that gets triggered as well because of the relationship with social media. And then finally, the technology. I think this is in some ways it should be the least surprising, because we've seen it used in various instances. And frankly, since the war on terror started. I mean, we knew this technology was going to evolve and have a lifespan well beyond kind of these targeted strikes with non-state actors. So this to me is the most fascinating and the hardest. And in terms of just what can be done, I don't have any new recommendations here, because the thing is that ideas to engage have been out there. They're just not being utilized. They're being hobbled. And so one is quiet communication through security institutions. Second, and probably one of the most important for me, is external actors like the US should not go in at the very last minute. They should build their relationships and think very strategically and carefully about the repercussions of retreat. And in this case, I mean, we saw this mixed messages over this is important to us and this is not important. And then finally, this doesn't get talked about a lot, but ever since partition, there has been a lot of track 2 and track 1.5 diplomacy happening between Indians and Pakistanis. That is being lost. That institutional memory of peacemaking and peace conversations is going away, mostly because people are dying and they don't exist, or they're not in these positions of power. There's a new generation of leaders that don't know each other and don't have the same cultural or familial history or affinity. That's very dangerous for conflict resolution. And so it's so cheap to do. And that's where another recommendation for external actors is to fund those conversations with new generations of interlocutors. That's the best we can hope for when these official channels are frozen.
We're all about conversations at IGP, and I think that sounds like sound advice. Jon Finer, where are we going from here?
So maybe just 2 points. Often with these things, maybe always with these things, there is sort of the kinetic conflict period, and then there's the conflict after the conflict. That's sort of the narrative fight over who got the upper hand, who's to blame, who came out looking stronger and who came out looking weaker. And I think that's playing out right now in real time. And so some of how long this lasts and how stable the environment is going to depend on this. I think you're already seeing indications, and it's come up on this call, that there is at least some Indian backlash against how the government resolved this conflict in the near term, including this issue, which I think they're going to continue to downplay and deny, maybe because it's right and maybe because it's disadvantageous, of how involved they allowed the United States to be. That does seem to be something that will be a vulnerability for the prime minister if it's proven to be accurate. So I think this how the narrative fight plays out. Pakistan not particularly good at its global narrative in the world. So I think the Indians will ultimately find a way to right the ship, given they've just got more friends in the international system right now. But for the moment, it does feel a little bit like Pakistan got the best of this in the narrative context. And so that could play a role. I just want to say one other quick thing, though, about what we kind of refer to sometimes as a tit for tat, a back and forth. I think that's both accurate and could benefit from a bit more nuance. What I think happens in these situations here and in other places is that often neither side wants escalation. In this case, I think it's quite clear that neither side wanted escalation. So what they try to do is this very delicate calibration where they want to be seen as if they are doing something new or different or stronger, but below the level of something that will trigger a broader war. And it's one thing to sit around in a room with a bunch of your colleagues and make a decision about what exactly that should be. But the risk of misinterpretation, miscalibration is extremely high, especially given, as was just said, there's maybe a less of a deep understanding on the two sides than there has been at earlier points in this kind of protracted standoff. And so the risk that you actually get that wrong, that you go a bit further maybe than you intended to in terms of provoking a much bigger response, is what was, I think, the main risk here. And so that's what, even though there are strategic factors that suppress escalation, I think I worry about most is that they just will decide to do something not anticipating a more severe response, and then you're off to the races.
Rajan Menon.
A couple of points, Steve. First, on the India-Pakistan factor, it is true that India's major antagonist is China. But China has every interest in having a flanking power on India's western flank. And the more India tacks toward the United States and is drawn in as a partner to contain China, the more the Pakistanis will build up China. So whichever way you slice it, the Pakistanis, the Indians will also always have to split their forces. Now, on escalation, what's interesting is that although Modi has this vision of a tough guy, 56-inch chest, and all of this, it's interesting that he took about 2 weeks before acting. He didn't rush to judgment. And once the Pakistanis did their retaliatory airstrike, the foreign minister, I believe, or maybe the defense minister said, we've done our bit now. If the Indians stop, we will stop. And he said, why isn't there more external mediation? So there was some sense of wanting to tamp this down. John is absolutely correct that once you take a mixed step that the other side misinterprets, all bets are off. But I'm not particularly that worried about nuclear escalation in this instance, because there's a tendency to think, oh, well, the Indians, the United States and the Russians, they're big boys, they know how to handle this. The Israelis and so on, so they know how to handle this. South Asians, I don't know, they're kind of crazy. It may go haywire. I think that just doesn't hold up very well. One final point on religion. I'm not hopeful for this reason. Kashmir has been since 1947 central to Pakistan's concept of what it is as a country, and it feels wronged. That is not going to go away. So this is not just a contest over real estate, right? On top of that, certainly starting with General Zia-ul-Haq, the Islamization, and I don't mean fundamental Islam or something, but the sense of being Muslim has seeped through the Pakistani army in a very significant way. But on the other side, you have one secular India going the route of Hindu identity. I hate to say this, but there's not a day when there's not some harassment or intimidation of Muslims in India. And so you have this religious polarization, which, to go back to John's point, can actually feed in to the misperception and risk-taking and worst-case thinking. So I'm not hopeful. There will be other skirmishes like this. There'll be other terrorist attacks. Do I think the two sides will be cavalier about using nuclear weapons? No, I don't.
Rumela Sen, you get the last word.
All right. I think I'll just build on everything that John, Shamila, and Rajan just mentioned. The first point being the importance of what happens within these countries will also determine what happens between these countries. And from India's point of view, I think, India actually abrogated Article 370 and Article 35A, which guaranteed autonomy to Kashmir. So domestic policy-wise, the way Kashmir has been the most militarized zone of the world, and then it also lost what was historically given to it as the status of autonomy, that does not help India in resolving, if not resolving, managing the conflict in Kashmir in a way that benefits India and its democratic credentials. So one of the things that the resistance front, which first took responsibility for this attack, said that this attack is actually a response to abrogation of Article 370 and the loss of autonomy of Kashmir, which may or may not be true and has been disputed. But what it comes down to is, in a country as big as India, where over 80% of the population is Hindu, it has a Hindutva party which is marginalizing the Muslims. That might be part of natural sort of democratic progression, that, okay, the majority Hindu has now found a right wing, but that does not mean it has to inevitably continue with this marginalization of the minorities that not only, sort of hurts its international image that we were talking about before, that India has an advantage internationally as a democracy, right, in terms of reputation and international, acceptance, that is very, very short-sighted for India. That's the first thing. So in terms of going forward, what would happen would very much depend on the direction of what we are now calling the democratic backsliding in India, which includes, the status of the freedom of press, which includes the status of civil liberties and the space for political opposition in India to actually oppose democratically within the parliament and in the larger political space what the ruling party is doing. And just to illustrate how difficult that has become and how that affected this conflict is, once the terrorists actually killed the innocent tourists, one of the things that captured the imagination and sort of tug at the heartstrings of the people is this young widow, this recently married woman who lost her husband, and her husband was lying dead and she was sitting next to it. And this powerful image of the sindoor, the reason this is called Operation Sindoor is what this red vermilion that married Hindu women would wear, and that she lost her sindoor only a few days after she got married. And also the color red that evokes this blood that was shed, right? So all of this narrative and imagery that was very carefully constructed by the media and also helped the ruling party for a little bit, right? That this sort of rallied opinion, public opinion, that this was wrong. But if the country becomes beholden to that, and the political elites become beholden to that, then the difference between a democracy and elite-driven, military-dominated Pakistan sort of becomes less and less. You want the democracy to be operated more on rationality and strategies and not so much driven by these primitive primordial emotions that's coming from religion and other differences among the citizens. So I think that will be a very important factor. Second is what Shamila also mentioned, is the role of information, disinformation, and social media. One of the fun things, and I mean, that's probably not the right thing to say, but one of the things that came up from Pakistan, from these ordinary people in Pakistan, are these memes that they created and circulated on social media that said, what can the Indian government do to us that the Pakistani government hasn't already done to us, to hurt us, right? And so, right, so that just ties into the role of the popular opinion that also would play a role in the direction this conflict is going to go. One last thing I wanted to mention in terms of disinformation and the role of the politics in it is the Indian government said that they are actually targeting terrorist infrastructure. As somebody who's been studying these extremist networks and terrorist infrastructure, there is no such thing. Terror networks are very complex. They are not really territorialized, and these kind of military, actions will never eliminate terrorist infrastructure, right? If we look into this a little bit, we know that this is actually, again, a sort of signaling to the popular audience and the popular media, which should not be the case in a democracy, in a mature democracy that wants to not be taken, and put in the same footing with Pakistan, right? That's what India has wanted forever, that do not put us in the same bracket as Pakistan. But as we are seeing now more and more compared to in the past, and maybe with social media, it's become more visible to all of us and to the world, is this tendency to slide into this kind of populism that does not really help in the kind of environment and the history of relationship that India and Pakistan has. But I also totally, agree with Rajan when he said that these two armies and these two political systems, they know each other. They have been coexisting with each other for a very long time, since 1947, and fighting many wars. So the chances that they will just make a mistake and actually escalate into a war, a nuclear war, are also very, very slim. So that's sort of a very scattered response in a very complex political military scenario to what will happen going ahead.
Thanks, Rumela, and let me thank all of our panelists for a stimulating discussion. I'd also like to thank our audience, especially those of you who may be students of international security policy. As the director of the International Security Policy Concentration here, I can't help but note the sheer number of concepts and principles and ideas that we have discussed in the curriculum that have been the warp and woof of our conversation this afternoon. Crisis management and the challenges of containing escalation in an environment of imperfect information, cognitive bias, and Clausewitzian friction. The whole problem of relative coercive leverage. The role of civil-military relations and domestic politics and foreign policy. These things are all the warp and woof of what we're trying to do at CEPA. Expertise matters in resolving international crises where there are literally millions of people's lives at stake. I hope this conversation has helped our audience to build expertise. I again thank the panelists, I thank the audience, and I hope you can join us at the next event for Columbia's and CEPA's Institute of Global Politics. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.